start. So you know how you've been wanting to get into beekeeping for a long time and you haven't really known where to start? Well, we're here to help you. Anita and I are building a connected beekeeping community, and we're doing that through seminars like this, workshops, mentoring and support. We're really here to help you on your beekeeping journey. You know, you can ask 3 beekeepers a question and get 10 different answers. It'll be no different tonight. So none of us here are experts. We're here to share our experience and our knowledge with you, okay? And as I was planning this event, I thought to myself, what were the 5 things that I would really have liked to have known when I started beekeeping? And there were really 5 key things, and I'm going to run through those very briefly. The first is time. The second was cost. The third was education. The 4th was location. And the 5th was motivation. So I'll just break those down a little bit for everyone. So the first one, time. You know, bees are not dogs, so you don't have to walk them every day, but we need to be realistic about the amount of time it takes to look after bees. We're generally talking about the bee season running anywhere in Australia from mid-August to mid-April. It could be shorter, it could be longer, just depending on the season. During that time, you really need to be checking your bees once every 2 weeks. I know that might be different for Anita and other people, but I do once every 2 weeks. And the reason for that is because queen bees are made in 16 days. So to prevent my hive from swarming, I need to check my hive and make sure there's no queen cells in there. So that's my reason for checking every 2 weeks. In the winter time, I don't check my bees. I winter them, what's called wintering down, and I make sure that I use that time to render my wax and to clean up any of my hive equipment. So you have the time in the spring and summer, and then the downtime in winter. The second question around cost, when you're looking at setting yourself up, and we do not encourage people to get secondhand equipment, you're looking at new equipment. Anywhere between $400 to $700 would be a rough estimate of how much it costs to set yourself up for beekeeping. Now, that may or may not include purchasing bees. Sometimes you can get bees by collecting a swarm, and other times you have to purchase bees, and Nita's going to talk about that a little bit later on. The third thing is education. So when you're thinking about beekeeping, and I'm guessing that some of you here have probably watched YouTube videos or done a little bit of reading, which is terrific. It's important that you keep seeking out that information. I've been a beekeeper for 20 years and I can never get enough information about bees. You need to have a willingness to listen and learn. So have a very open mind and an infinite mindset, because you are going to hear conflicting information from beekeepers, but be willing to listen and learn. Make mistakes. Don't be frightened about making mistakes. It's the doing that matters. It's really important also, because I'm aware we've got people from all over Australia here, it's really important also that you actively seek out your local associations. So in every single state and territory in Australia, there's a range of commercial and recreational beekeeping associations who are there to support you and to offer mentoring and advice. Some of those people are commercial beekeepers and some of them are recreational beekeepers, but they'll offer you a lot of information. And of course, the other important part of education that I can't forget is making sure you know a little bit about bee diseases. I'm not going to overwhelm talking about them here, but the important point about bee disease is that when you're a beekeeper, unlike walking a dog, you're actually becoming a primary producer. So you're now in the agricultural sector, and any of your practices and the things that you do can, you know, have a very detrimental effect on the broader beekeeping industry. So these are things just to be mindful of and to be aware of. Each state has different biosecurity laws. I do recommend, I'm going to hold up an ARBIC document here, but it's the Biosecurity Code of Practice. And it's really important that you perhaps seek that out online or through the Australian Honeybee Industry Council. It has some very useful information in there. The fourth thing is location. So think about where you live and think about the proximity of your neighbour's property. People get very frightened of bees, but you need to be realistic about how much space you have. You need to think about the size of your block. You need to think about how much available bee forage there is. You might have a great paddock somewhere, but it could be a desert for bees. So you just need to be aware that more space doesn't necessarily mean better location for bees. Sometimes smaller spaces are better. And in fact, urban and suburban beekeepers often get more honey than commercial beekeepers because there's gardens that flower for 4 seasons of the year. So have a think about that. And the other thing, of course, before I move on to the next point, is your local bylaws or codes of practice. So some councils have particular laws around keeping bees and others don't. Also, different states and territories have been implementing a beekeeping urban code of practice. And here in southern Tasmania, we do have an urban beekeeping code of practice that's been developed by our local association, the Southern Tasmanian Beekeepers Association. And I encourage people to seek that information online. It's there and it's available for you because it will help you to pad out a little bit more this question about, am I ready, or can I keep bees where I live? The final point I wanted to make was about motivation. So ask yourself why you're doing it. So some people want to keep bees for the honey, but you need to think about what you might do if honey isn't available, because of course every season's different. We get dry seasons, we get wet seasons, windy seasons. You know, beekeeping can be a very marginal activity, and you need to know how to look after your bees if there's no honey available. And of course, the flip side of that is if you're just getting bees for pollination, you need to think about what you might do if you get a big, what we call a honey flow, which is when bees go out, they collect nectar out of all the flowers, they bring it back into the hive. And then you might find yourself suddenly having to either purchase or build new bee boxes, and all of a sudden you've got, you know, hundreds of kilos of honey that you don't know what to do with it. So there are all the kinds of considerations you need to think about before you start to get into beekeeping. And before I pass to Anita, there is one last saying that I would like to add to my comments here, which is that often people get into beekeeping for the bees, but they get out because of the honey. So I will leave you with that and pass you on to Anita, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Jen. Firstly, welcome everyone to World Bee Day. How exciting. I literally 2 minutes before we came on, I thought I'm going to throw on that bee suit. So just for fun. So my name is Anita Long and I am a recreational beekeeper. I'm also, my passion is youth beekeeping, and so teaching our children and our young adults both bee awareness and practical beekeeping skills. I'm also really passionate about building networks, so that's why Jenny and I really do connect, because we're both connectors, which is fantastic. So I've got 5 questions that most people ask a beekeeper. So one of them is, you know, how do I get bees? And so for many people, they don't exactly know, you know, they might have got their hive and then they're like, how do I get my bees? And so I always say the best thing is to go to a registered beekeeper, look and see if they've got nukes for sale. And usually this starts happening around springtime. But the best thing, and from experience, is going and asking now if you can be put on a waiting list for some bees, because you could be waiting your whole life for a swarm of bees. Trust me, I think we've got hundreds of our children are just waiting for their swarm. But yeah, so ring your local beekeeping association or group, and yeah, see if you can be put down on a Nuke waiting list, which is a good idea. If you ever do get stuck, we have a local producer here, a local beekeeper here, and they produce usually a couple of 100 nukes a year. And so they're a fantastic way of getting your bees. They also supply a biosecurity form with your bees, so they've been checked for diseases and things like that. So one thing I would say is, if you are buying a nuke off someone, and I know Tasmanian Junior Beekeepers had nukes for sale this year, and we'll certainly have some for sale next season as well. We will be providing that buyer's declaration with these ones coming this year. So ask for a buyer's declaration if you're buying a nuke. And if they don't know what it is, they probably shouldn't be selling you their bees. Another question I get asked is, how do I know if I'm allergic? Now, oh, sorry, I've just seen a question. What is a nuke? So a nuke is a nucleus hive, which is a small hive. Usually starts off with a queen and just a few frames of bees. And it's kind of like a small colony that then grows into a bigger colony. So how do I know if I'm allergic? Now, as a person who runs an organisation with lots and lots of children, over 80 children, that's my biggest concern. How do we know if a child or anybody is allergic? Some things that we've found is you may not actually be allergic to a bee the very first time that you're stung. So if you haven't been stung before, or if you have been stung once before and you get stung again, or sorry, if you haven't had an allergy or reaction, doesn't mean that you're not allergic. It can happen on the second or third or 100th sting. So you can also visit your doctor and go and do some allergy testing. But sometimes if people are really allergic to jack jumpers, we've been told that there's a similar protein to bee venom as there is to jack jumper. I'm not sure whether they call it venom or just whatever it is. So yeah, sometimes people can be allergic to both. So if in doubt, check with your doctor. Because and this is something that we're very serious about with safety, is as a beekeeper, I think it's best practice if you were to have an EpiPen with you at all times. Another question I get asked is, how do I find a mentor? Now, I know Jenny and I are extremely grateful for our mentors. My mentor is named Laurie Cohen, and he's just turned 80. And I know Jen's is Laurie, and I'm sure he's getting up there too. But the thing is, finding a mentor, the best way to do is find someone who fits within who you feel comfortable with and follows your ethics and your values. Joining a beekeeping group, or just meeting them at a field day or a workshop or something like that. Now, this is a controversial one, but I thought I'd put it in here. And I often get asked, what types of hives should I start with? Now, this can get tricky because in Tasmania we have, or everywhere across the world, there's polarizing views on what hives are the best and things like that. I don't know, and now I'm saying this as a person who is over the age of 40 and doesn't like to lift very, very heavy things. I personally prefer ideal size, so smaller boxes. As a person who runs beekeeping group, a kids beekeeping group, I should say, we also prefer smaller boxes, but we also have full depths as well. So what type of hive should you start with? It comes down to your personal values, and the best thing is to ask a beekeeper around you if they've had any experience with those types of hives. Of course, we all know the flow hive is an amazing invention by a group of beekeepers up in, is it New South Wales, northern New South Wales? Now, I know of people here in Tassie that have great results with flow hive in urban areas, but personally, we haven't had very good results. And so we've just, because the reason we've had bad results is where we are in a rural environment, we have the flora we have is prickly box, and prickly box candies really, really quickly. So there's certainly no flowing of anything happening when you've got that, flora inside your hive, or sorry, that nectar and honey inside your hive. But, the thing is that's really important is don't get too caught up on what type of hive you've got. The thing is, what I always say is your bees don't mind where they live. Some bees are happier. Some bees are happier in a tree. Some bees are happy, in a garbage bin. But like I said, do a bit of research for your local area. But yeah, try not to get too hung up. If you find, sorry, there's just someone with a bit of feedback there. That's okay. But yeah, so have a look around, do some research, and yeah, go from there. And that's one of the questions. I love saying this is because I get asked by probably at least 5 children a lesson. Do bees sleep? Now, I know this is not a question you may need to know, but just so you do know, bees do sleep. So that's always good. And just checking on how we're going with time there, Jen. We good?
Yeah, it's good.
Can I just say one of the questions that I think most people get asked as beekeepers by people that aren't beekeepers yet are things like, what can I do now for my bee or for the bees? And a few things like planting, you know, growing some food for our bees, flowering trees, all going to help our bees. Don't use toxic herbicides and pesticides in your garden. Our bees don't need that in their stomachs. Also really support your local beekeeper. Go and buy their honey and keep them in business because they may actually become your mentor. So build a relationship with your local beekeeper. And the other thing is I always say is chill out with your weeds. You know, those dandelions and things are the food for our bees. So don't become too fussy about those bees. Kind of loosen up on your gardening. That's my opinion. But yeah, thank you so much, everybody. And I'll hand back over to you, Jen.
Okay, thank you, Anita. That was really informative. We've had a couple of questions come through, which I think we've semi-answered. We still have about probably 20 minutes. Are there any pressing questions that people have they'd like to ask Anita or myself? You're welcome to unmute and just ask us, or you can type it in the chat box, whatever's easiest. No question is stupid. I can tell you now there's a heap of questions that I constantly have as a beekeeper. You know, I'm learning new things all the time. I think the last time I was out in the hives, you know, I saw, gosh, I think I saw two queens in one hive. I'd heard about that before, but I'd never actually seen it. So, you know, we're always learning something new. So use this opportunity because we've left 20 minutes deliberately so that you can ask both of us questions. Would anyone like to start? Okay, can you paint the hive? There's a question, Anita.
You certainly can paint the hive. In fact, I think the more colourful, the better. But truthfully, the thing when you're painting hives is always go for a lighter colour than a darker colour. The reason we do that is because obviously darker colours can absorb more heat and we don't want to have to make our bees work harder than they need to. So lighter colours. There is a lot of discussion about whether you should paint the inside of a hive, and that comes down to, once again, you ask, you know, 3 different beekeepers, you'll get 20 different questions. We personally do paint inside our hives. We also let them air for a good 6 weeks to kind of cope with those fumes. But painting inside also does protect I think the moisture that gets inside a hive, in the sense of you know, bees create a lot of moisture when they're living. So yeah, paint your hives. Yeah,
and you can get paint from, I usually get my paint, just a exterior water-based paint. I get mine from the tip shop, so I can get a litre for $5, and all of my hives are kind of a yellow, different shades of yellow, and cream. So I just go there to get cheap paint. Otherwise, you're paying $60 for the same amount of honey from a paint shop. Paint from a paint shop. So it's always good to visit and support and upcycle where we can. Another good question we've had come through: how much food do you need to have around an urban beehive to maintain them? That's a really good question, Stacey. We were talking about this earlier on. Size doesn't matter so much, and as long as you've got, when I say size, I mean area around you, because if you've got people in the community with gardens, that's a really useful start. And if you've got people in the community who plant 4-season gardens, that's even better. So when you say how much food, I know there is a number, isn't there, Anita, for bees per flower? At the moment, I've got 9 hives in my backyard on a very narrow peninsula, and my bees are doing just fine, but I've got people who garden around me relentlessly, and so my bees have access. And also the blue gum is starting to come into flower here at the moment. So probably a short answer, Stacey, to cut my words down, know what's growing in your area, and bees will forage for 5 kilometres approximately, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes less, 5 kilometre radius. So know within a 5 kilometre radius what grows, both in the gardens and what's growing naturally. And we'll also talk a little bit about weeds here. And for me anyway, prickly box grows down the side of the road. So look at the gum trees in your area or any other kind of native plants growing down the side of the road, and take note of when they're budding up and when they're flowering, because that's going to be really valuable to you. One of my decisions as an urban beekeeper was we had a community project where flowering gum avenue was planted down our main road, and that meant that we then had honey available. I knew it was a very high nectar source plant. It was a Eucalyptus ficofolia, and it flowers when everything else is in dearth, and dearth means that the bees don't have access to food. So I knew that if I got bees, I would have honey pretty much from November all the way through to March, or nectar available for my bees. So that's the kind of thinking that I went through in my decision-making process. So it's a good question, Stacey.
Can I just add to that, Jen? A really good way of doing that is go onto Google Earth and pinpoint where your hive is, and do a 5 kilometre radius is a good guide. I've just returned from the Victorian Recreational Beekeepers Association annual conference, and some of the scientists I got to hear from there actually have done studies that bees are now, if they need a certain protein in the pollen that they get, they can travel. They've been traveling up to 8 kilometres for that pollen, even though there was pollen much closer. So the bees will seek out, up to 8 kilometres, which I find just fascinating. But if you do a Google drop and have a look 8 kilometre rate, an 8 kilometre circle, it's amazing to think of how many floral sources are in that. I did just see, I'm not sure if is it booby? Sorry, it's not booby, is it? It's not booby. So, bubby, hopefully. I'm sorry. Is that they paint the inside of their hive with melted beeswax and oil, and yes, that's something that we did trial as well. So that has worked as well for us as well. So I'm glad to see that. Jen, where's a good list? Where's a good list of plants to provide food for all year round?
Well, it's interesting because I was looking at the Ween Bee Foundation of all places yesterday, Anita, and I noticed they got funding for different pamphlets for bee-friendly plantings. I've developed my own for the Bee Collective, which I'm happy to post online if people want to access that. So I can pop that up tomorrow and people can just go and have a look. And this is something I've developed for southeastern Tasmania. Some of those plants will be useful for everybody, but yeah, just be mindful. I live in a dry, arid, sandy environment. So I have a lot of Western Australian type plants and things that love sandy soil. I'm happy to share what I've got, but it does change from place to place. With the plant list. But if you know plants that work well for you, please share them in the chat box now, because it's a really important thing that we plant continuously for bees where we are.
Another really good reference I've just remembered actually, Jen, is the beekeeping book, Beekeeping at the End of the World by Mark Leach.
Yes.
That's a really great book. Off she goes. That's a really good book, especially for novice beekeepers as well as experienced beekeepers. But we have that in our children's library, and some of our children who've taken that and read that have got a lot out of it. And it also lists, which is a really cool thing, is the different protein and nectar values of trees. Because as we know, or maybe we don't know, bees need both pollen and nectar, and nectar is their carbohydrate part of their diet, and the pollen is their protein part of the diet. And so sometimes you can have flowering trees, but they literally have no nutritional value at all for the bees, or some have extremely low nectar, but they might be really high in pollen. So when it comes to planting, it's a really good idea to know what those values are and kind of plant accordingly to that as well.
Yeah, I just nicked off to look for there's actually an Australian book. It's done by the CSIRO. I went to my library just to find it, but I will find it and I'll send it out as an email to people tomorrow. It's actually quite a thick book, and it tells you what to plant in urban areas, what to plant in a farm, what to plant streetscape, and it gives you the pollen value of the plant and the nectar value of the plant, because people will often say things like, oh, I've got a lot of wattles in my area, so I'm going to get heaps of honey. Well, I'm sorry, but you're not. Wattles provide a really important pollen source for bees, but not nectar. And it's the same with other plants as well. People think, oh, I've got that's in flower, so they must be getting something from that. Not necessarily. They may be getting nothing from that. And that's the other interesting thing about bees too, isn't it, Anita? That, you know, bees are filial to flowers, so they won't just willy-nilly go from one to the other, to the other, to the other. Once they find a nectar source, they go back to the hive. They do their waggle dance, which is an incredible dance that, you know, indicates the position, you know, where the flower source is, to tell all the other bees where to go. And then they go and they get as much nectar as they can from that particular plant. They don't just go and have bits and pieces everywhere necessarily. They're quite filial. So we've got here a good
what's that word you're using?
Filial. It means loyal, like loyal to the plant. They're just, yeah, they're loyal to that species. So a good book is the Australian Beekeeping Manual by Robert Owen. I haven't read that one, but thank you for that. That looks good. Yeah,
I learned a new word today. Thanks, Jen.
Oh, well, I'm glad. I'm really glad that I could help you. Yeah, and yeah, so I think that just highlights again, you know, reading as much as you can about bees. You can never get too much information, and I think through groups like this coming together, you share information and knowledge, and it's a really important way of building our bee understanding, because bees are actually the most researched insect in the world, but we still really know nothing. And a lot of the time we're, you know, discovering new things and finding out new things that we never knew. And the more we share, the more we can understand their incredible little worlds. Any other questions that people might have at the moment?
I was just wondering, Jen, do we have people on here who actually are not beekeepers but want to become beekeepers?
Are most people here beekeepers, or are they just thinking about at this point?
Yay, Vicky. 2 more years, Vicky, and she can come and join us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If we have a hive in our yard, are we restricting the food source for native insects? That's a good question too, Anita. Thinking about myself and my 2 kids, we home educate, and her little friend across the road has bees in his family, so there's an interest, which is really good. And that's a really good point too. You don't have to keep bees to be a bee protector. You know, there's things you can do, as Anita said, planting your garden, paying attention to them, not using glyphosate or neonicotinoids or fipronil. And I'm not sure if people are aware, but fipronil is a common chemical used in things like flea, what do they call those things? You put flea baits or flea powder on your animals. And it's absolutely deadly, not just to bees, but all pollinators. You know, and these are the things that the good thing about World Bee Day is it makes this little world of invisible people visible, or invisible creatures. I think of them as people sometimes. It's a little bit weird. So yeah, going back to that question about native bees, there's a lot of discussion about that, and I've noticed in the last probably 3 years a lot of people talking about that. Yeah, it's interesting. I think the research is still kind of debatable on that. Would you agree, Anita? I know that I've talked to different beekeepers about it. I've talked to native bee experts who are adamant that European bees are competitive with native bees, but the reality of the situation is at this point in time, European bees are our biggest pollinators. We eat European food. They pollinate European crops. It's the reality of our world. There's some great work happening at the moment with Tasmanian pollination services. Both Anita and I have had a chance to see what they're doing around drone pollination, drone fly pollination. So drone flies look like bees. They are
hoverflies, Jen.
Drone flies, yeah, hoverflies, drone flies.
Right, yep.
So they look like drones, look like bee drones. They've got big eyes, and I'll send a picture through tomorrow so you can see what they look like. But they're finding them to be really effective pollinators. So what they've discovered is that the drone fly or the hoverfly is active the hours before a bee becomes active and the hours after the bee goes to bed. So it's creating this extended pollination period by using drone flies alongside the bees, the native drone flies. So there doesn't seem to be any competitive issues there, but it's a good question, and I know there's a lot of research coming in on that still. What else have we got here? We have a lot of stringy bark on our property. Yes, now stringy bark's an interesting one. So a friend of mine here in South she keeps her beehives down at Pirates Bay. She's got about 10 beehives. Last year, she had the most extraordinary stringy bark season. It was off the show. And stringy bark is my favourite honey. Well, I've got about 10 favourite honeys, but stringy bark is one of them. And this year, I saw her about a week ago. I said, how did you go this year? She said, no honey, I have to go and feed my bees. So again, it's an example of, you know, just because you got the honey last year doesn't mean it's going to come in again this year. And stringy bark certainly is like that. We've got blue gums flowering at the moment. I'm keeping my fingers crossed we might get some blue gum honey, but again, no guarantees. So we'll keep our eyes open for that. How do you feed the bees, Anita? There's a question for you that you can answer.
Okay, so I'm happy to answer this. We do feed our bees when they are at risk of dying or starving, and which is kind of both the same, I suppose. But we actually only feed a sugar syrup now. The reason we do that is due to there can be spores and different things in honey. So as part of biosecurity, and I know we all have different views on this, but we would not ever put honey, we would never feed our bees honey unless it was from the exact hive it came out of. And we don't have that much organisation at the moment we don't know, we do know what frames come out of our hives, but when it comes to, some people freeze those. So if you had 1 or 2 hives, you could freeze, you know, hive A and hive B, and you could pop them back in. But I would never recommend ever transferring honey between hives. So the safest way for us to do that is to feed with a sugar syrup. Now, that sugar syrup is only ever white sugar. You don't use anything else. And that at a recent, like I said, the recent event I went into, I heard some amazing research being done on feeding bees and nutrition, and how not only does the nutrition help the bees obviously when they're starving, but poor bees or poor nutrition for bees when they're developing in the larval stages can be detrimental for their entire life. So that's how I feed bees, but everyone is different. But like I said, that's what we do. How about you, Jen?
Well, I don't feed my bees sugar, as you know. So my mentor, he's 82 years old, and I learnt to be a beekeeper about 20 years ago, and I went with him out into the Leatherwood. And the way that he keeps bees is he leaves boxes of honey on the hives, which I encourage people to do as well. I live in an area that when I started keeping bees, I was told you'll never be able to get honey there. There's no flowers, it's too dry. I've only had 1 season out of the last 10 that's been weird. That was last year, but every other year I've had bumper season with my honey. So yeah, I leave a lot of honey on my hives, which costs me financially, that costs me, because obviously honey on the hive is honey I can't sell, but that's a decision that I make. So again, beekeepers doing different things. I haven't needed to feed my bees. But if I had to, if it meant they were going to die, then I would feed my bees. But I live in a different space to Anita. I live in a kind of a peri-urban environment with gardens around me, as well as bush and a little bit of farmland. So it's a little bit different than where Anita lives.
Whereas we are rural, and we were in a terrible drought, and the prickly box, which is prolific where we are, just simply didn't provide any nectar for our bees. And so even though we planted a whole heap of buckwheat, which is an amazing and very quick growing floral source for our bees, we also did have to supplement feed. And our approach to wintering our bees is to always leave more than the bees should require over winter in our hives. So there are some beekeepers that will literally strip every bit of honey off their hives and then replace with a sugar syrup. That's certainly not our practices. But like I said, if if our bees were starving or in, you know, about to die, a sugar syrup. Now I was just looking at it, says the sugar syrup is 1 to 1. That is true, or you can also do 2 to 1 as well.
Another question there, Anita, how do you know how much they'll need?
Well, that's a good question, because what happens there is, and this is a tricky one, we do it by feel. And so my mentor once said to me, you need to pick up that hive when it's full. When you winter it down, you've got, you know, a couple of boxes full of honey, and feel what it weighs. And it took me a while to get that.
Back.
Yeah, from the back, just heave it up. And so you get to know how much, you know, how much roughly it weighs. During winter, because I don't like to open the hives during winter, if I feel it and it is really light, like I will actually go into that top box and have a quick look. If they're starving, that's when, you know, we'd you know, make amends with, you know, feeding and stuff like that. But the thing is, I have left, and this is just the way the bees are, I have left sometimes 3 ideals of full honey on bees, and I've gone back, you know, the first opening in spring and they're still full. And you've left, so the next year we thought, well, let's only do 2, and we've done 2 and we had to feed our bees. So it just comes through, is just getting to know your bees. Now that's an interesting question, Vicky. Can you still use that honey? Some people do, and that's fine. Usually when you are feeding bees isn't usually the time, like if early spring or late winter, if they haven't got enough stores, it's usually not the time that you're extracting honey. So I have heard of people using coloured dyes and things, but recently, once again, listening to the research of that can actually be poisonous and detrimental to the bees. So the thing is, when it comes down to it, and I don't want to get too technical, but nectar, I won't get too technical in this one. We might leave that for the next one, about the difference between how bees convert nectar and the sugar components and things like that. But how often should you harvest from a hive? What do you think, Jen?
Well, my answer to that would be only when there's a honey flow on, and you know there's a honey flow on because remember you're checking your bees regularly in the season. The bee season runs from mid-August to mid-April, so you're checking them every 2 weeks, and you will notice, because you'll see the frames of honey start filling up in your boxes, and once that happens, you need to start putting empty boxes on top, and once you've got empty boxes on top, you can start to take frames away. So again, I'm not going to be prescriptive about how much honey you take. You need to be a little bit switched on about what goes on where you live and how long you expect that honey flow to last for. So usually when a tree flowers, it's 6 to 8 weeks. Sometimes it can be 12 weeks. We can get 12 weeks. We did this year out of the leatherwood. But yeah, so it's going to be a little bit different where you live and what you do. So it changes from time to time, but it's a good question. And you can leave the honey on from last season, and you can also harvest that honey and eat it, because honey, just answering that question above it, because honey doesn't go off. So I could put my honey in the freezer and it could be frozen for 200 years, not even in the freezer, as long as wax moth doesn't get to it, and you could eat it in 200 years time. It wouldn't matter. It doesn't go off. It just crystallizes. I'm just mindful of the time, Anita. We're getting towards the end of our kind of free availability on Zoom land. There's been a lot of content tonight with people. If there are any other pressing questions that people might have, you've got our email address. You've got my email address. We're going to send you out an email tomorrow. We're running a survey at the moment to find out what kind of information and practical sessions people would like to be involved in. If you could fill that in, that would be great, because we're planning ongoing sessions to stay as a connected beekeeping community. Anything else, Anita, that you'd like to add?
I suppose one thing about that honey from the previous season, often it's candied or crystallized, and in the frames, so it crystallizes in the actual cells. Now that you can't extract that, so that's really difficult. But what you can do, and this is something my mentor showed me how to do, is by just gently kind of breaking the cap from the honey, the bees will actually retake that in regurgitate it, and actually redo it. So sometimes what we've done is, if we've had a lot of really crystallized honey, we've broken up the top of that, the wax capping, and gone back, you know, a week later or so, and that's beautifully runny honey again. So yeah, if anyone's had to do that, that's a little trick that, yeah. But I suppose for me, Jen, I think it's important. I mean, I've only been beekeeping about 7 years, and so very, very new and still learning lots. But the thing that I did a course, and I met friends through that. But sometimes those courses were over 3 months, whereas now most of the courses are either 1 day, 2 days, or over a couple of weeks. So you don't have enough time to build connections with people. And I think that's why it's important more than ever, is to have connected beekeeping groups. So when there is a problem, you kind of got someone to ring. Many of the people that appear on, you know, like our association registers, if you yell out if you need help, are actually really, really busy during beekeeping season, because they might be commercial beekeepers or they're looking after hundreds of hives. So it's really good, whether someone's been beekeeping 1 year, 2 years, 20 years, it's good to have those connections, across the board, I think, when time.
Good point, Anita. Thank you very much. And a lot of content we've given people today. So we'll save this video. We'll send it in the email tomorrow. Happy World Bee Day to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's really lovely to meet all of you, and I hope that you join us again in the future. And we really appreciate your time. So thank you so much. See you later. Yeah.
Thank you, Jen.
So welcome. I've got to make sure I don't. You've recorded before, haven't you? I just have to unrecord.
Yes, just press stop recording.